The Sterling family was the untouchable royalty of the East Coast, hiding their scandals behind billion-dollar smiles and a perfect PR record. But on a Sub-Zero Friday, that record was stained with blood. The family's golden girl didn't just lose her home. She became a ghost in the making, left to freeze on the gravel of her own driveway. Her designer coat was useless. Her breathing was slowing. Her family watched from the window as she prepared to die. No one could help her until the snow was pierced by a pair of piercing LED headlights. Not a neighbor, but a man in a black suit with a long coat and a heart of ice. This isn't just a story about surviving a storm. It is the moment a single gaze ignited a fire that would consume the Sterling's world. The snow in this part of the country didn't just cover the ground, it buried the truth. Outside the Sterling mansion, the storm was a white wall of screaming wind. Inside the foyer, Aaliyah Grant's fingers were numb as she clawed at the locked mahogany door. Through the glass, her foster mother didn't look angry, she looked bored. She simply turned off the porch light. The darkness was absolute. Aaliyah slumped into the drift, her thin sweater soaking up the sleet as her vision began to tunnel. 11:42 p.m. please, she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the gale. The silence was heavy until the ground began to vibrate. It wasn't the thunder. It was the low, rhythmic hum of a 12-cylinder engine. A massive black SUV didn't just pull up, it loomed out of the whiteout like a predator. The door didn't just open, it swung wide with a mechanical click that sounded like a gun being cocked. A man stepped out. He was sharp, precise, and moved with a calm that mocked the chaos of the storm. Tae-sung Kim didn't rush to her side. He stood over her, a dark silhouette against his own headlights, looking down at the broken girl in the snow with eyes that saw a weapon, not a victim. The latch on the side door didn't click, it thudded, a heavy sound that meant the warmth of the Sterling mansion was now a closed chapter. Aaliyah stood on the gravel, her breath blooming in the dark like a ghost leaving her body. She didn't scream or bang on the glass. She simply looked at the door, her expression as still as the statues in the foyer. She had known this was coming since she saw the ledger on her foster father's desk. The wind didn't just blow, it searched. It found the gaps in her thin sweater and the dampness in her hair. As she walked away from the porch, the lights of the house began to shrink. She reached the end of the long driveway, where the manicured lawn met the wild, unlit road. Her legs felt heavy, as if the cold was turning her blood to lead. When she finally went down, it wasn't a dramatic fall. She simply sat, then curled into the powder, her cheek resting against the ice. The headlights that cut through the storm were a sharp, clinical white. They didn't flicker. They grew larger, steady and unbothered by the gale, until a black SUV loomed over her like a silent cliffside. The engine didn't die. It hummed, a low vibration that Aaliyah felt in her teeth. A door opened. Footsteps approached, crunching the frozen gravel with a slow, rhythmic weight. Aaliyah didn't look up. She felt the shadow of a man fall over her, blocking the wind for a brief, strange moment. Tae-sung Kim didn't kneel to see if she was breathing. He didn't call out for an ambulance. Instead, he reached down with a gloved hand and began to search her. He moved with the efficiency of a man looking for a misplaced key. His fingers ignored her shivering frame, moving directly to the pockets of her soaked sweater. He found what he was looking for in the inner lining, a small, encrypted flash drive she had sewn into the hem days ago. His hand found it too easily. Not by luck. Exactly where she had placed it. Tae-sung stood back up, the drive disappearing into the pocket of his wool coat. He looked toward the Sterling mansion, then back down at the girl, who was now nearly covered in white. "You chose a very loud way to disappear," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of pity, carrying a weight that made the storm feel small. Aaliyah's eyes flickered open, just a crack. She didn't thank him. She didn't ask for help. She only watched as he opened the rear door of the vehicle. It wasn't an invitation, it was a transition. "Get in," he commanded. The registry is already checking the perimeter. If you stay here, you're just a body. If you come with me, you're a problem. Aaliyah didn't hesitate. She dragged her frozen limbs toward the car, leaving a dark trail in the pristine snow. She had expected a savior, but as she looked at the cold, calculating set of Taesung's jaw, she realized she had found something much more useful, an accomplice. The first thing Aaliyah noticed wasn't the warmth, but the silence. It was a thick, engineered quiet that only existed in places built for people who paid to be invisible. She opened her eyes to a ceiling so high it felt like the sky. She was no longer wearing the soaked rags from the storm. Instead, she was wrapped in heavy, white linens that smelled of nothing at all. She didn't sit up immediately. She stayed still, letting her breath move in a steady rhythm while her eyes traveled across the room. She was in a suite on the 50th floor, where the floor-to-ceiling windows showed nothing but the gray belly of clouds and the occasional flash of a distant skyscraper. To anyone else, the room was a masterpiece of gold and velvet. To Aaliyah, it was a map. She noted the heavy mahogany door, no visible handle on the inside. She tracked the subtle, dark dome of a camera lens tucked into the crown molding. She counted 3 paces from the bed to the bathroom, and another 5 to the window. She didn't check the door first. She checked the camera, then the blind spot, then the distance to the hallway, like someone who had already planned to leave. In a separate room filled with the blue glow of wall-to-wall monitors, Taesung Kim sat with a glass of tea that had long since gone cold. He watched the screen showing the bedroom. He had seen many people wake up in this suite. Usually they cried. Sometimes they screamed. Most scrambled for the door. But Aaliyah Grant just watched the ceiling. Taesung leaned forward. On the screen, he saw her finally move. She didn't check her reflection in the mirror or reach for the water pitcher on the nightstand. She stood up and walked to the corner of the room, the one spot where the camera's angle was slightly obstructed by the curve of a decorative pillar. She stayed there for a long moment, her hand grazing the wallpaper. "She's not looking for a way out," Taesung murmured to the empty room. "She's looking for the blind spots." He pressed a button on his desk, and the door to the suite hissed open. He didn't enter. He waited for her to come to him. When she finally stepped into the hallway, her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes were sharp. "The Sterlings think you're dead," Taesung said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "But they've already sent a payment to the registry to verify the body. There is no body to find." Aaliyah stopped a few feet away from him. She noticed a small smudge of ink on his thumb, the mark of someone who had been going through old, physical files. "They won't stop at a body," Aaliyah said. Her voice was raspy from the cold, but steady. "They'll want the drive back. And they know you have it." Taesung looked at her, really looked at her. He realized then that she hadn't just used him to escape the snow. She had brought the war to his front door on purpose. The pressure in the room shifted. It wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was an entrapment. "I don't keep things that bring me trouble," Taesung said quietly. Aaliyah didn't flinch. "Then you shouldn't have checked my pockets." Taesung studied her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You didn't survive the storm by accident." Aaliyah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The hotel moved with the quiet precision of a clock. Every morning, a silver tray arrived at the suite, carried by staff who never met Aaliyah's eyes. Taesung sat across from her at the mahogany table, his attention divided between a tablet and his tea. The high-altitude sun hit the gold accents of the room, but the warmth felt fake. Aaliyah watched the young waiter who entered to clear the breakfast service. He was efficient, his movements rehearsed. But as he reached for a crystal glass, his sleeve shifted. For a split second, a small, faded mark was visible on the inside of his wrist, 2 interlocking circles with a horizontal line. Aaliyah didn't gasp. She didn't even move her hands from her lap. She had seen that exact mark on the neck of the man who did the Sterling's dirty work. It was the mark of the cleaners, the people who made sure mistakes never stayed in the light. The waiter left the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Aaliyah waited until the heavy door hissed shut before she looked at Tae-sung. He was still scrolling through his tablet, seemingly oblivious. "Your staff has changed," she said quietly. Tae-sung didn't look up. "I cycle the service every 3 days. It's a standard security protocol." "The man who just left," Aaliyah continued, her voice steady but low. "He has a mark on his wrist. It belongs to the people who work for my foster father. The registry isn't just checking the perimeter anymore, Tae-sung. They're inside." Tae-sung finally set the tablet down. He leaned back, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call his security team. Instead, he simply watched her, the silence between them stretching until it felt like a physical weight. "The registry is very expensive," Tae-sung said. "To get someone into my private service in less than 24 hours would cost a fortune. It would almost require someone on the inside to open a side door." He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city below. "How do I know you didn't leave that door open for them? Maybe you aren't a ghost, Aaliyah. Maybe you're the bait." Aaliyah realized then that he wasn't surprised. He wasn't even worried. He was testing her. He wanted to see if she would panic, or if she would try to run. The pressure in the suite shifted from the threat of the assassin to the threat of the man standing 5 feet away. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have warned you," she said. Tae-sung turned back to her, a small, cold smile touching his lips. "Or, you're warning me to gain my trust before the real strike happens." He walked to the door and swiped his key card, locking it from the outside. "Stay in the suite. If that waiter comes back, we'll see whose side you're really on." He locked the door, not to keep someone out, but to see if she would try to leave. The red light on the suite's wall didn't flash. It simply glowed, a steady, bleeding color that replaced the soft gold of the morning. Aaliyah stood by the mahogany table, listening to the sudden death of the building's hum. The air conditioning had stopped. The soft white noise of the hotel was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it made her ears ring. Tae-sung didn't return to the room. Instead, his voice came through the wall-mounted intercom, sounding filtered and cold. "Don't touch the door. The elevators have been remotely killed from the basement. We are boxed in." Aaliyah walked to the monitor station Tae-sung had left open. The screens were flickering. One feed showed the service hallway just outside. She saw a man she recognized, Jean, Tae-sung's right-hand man, the one who had driven the SUV through the storm. He wasn't guarding the door. He was standing by the service panel, holding a mobile device that glowed with the same interlocking circle logo she had seen on the waiter's wrist. Jean wasn't breaking in. He was handing over the digital keys. "Your shadow is talking to the sun," Aaliyah said into the intercom. There was a long pause. When Tae-sung spoke again, his voice was lower, tighter. "I see him. He's not just talking. He's bypassing the floor's thermal sensors. He's bringing the registry up the freight stairs." Aaliyah watched the screen. Jean looked up at the camera, his face a mask of stone, and then the feed went black. One by one, the monitors died. The luxury suite, once a palace of high-tech safety, was now just a room at the end of a very long, very high hallway. "Tae-sung," Aaliyah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If the elevators are dead, how do you get out?" "I don't," the intercom crackled. "And neither do you. The registry doesn't leave witnesses, and Jean knows exactly where the panic room is hidden. He helped me build it." Aaliyah looked around the room. She didn't look for a weapon. She looked for the service vents she had mapped out on her first day. She saw the small, brass-colored grate near the floor. It was too small for a man like Tae-sung, but for her it was a choice. "They're coming for the drive, not just us," Aaliyah said. "If Jean knows your moves, stop making them. Change the game." "What are you doing?" Tae-sung asked. Aaliyah knelt by the vent, her fingers finding the latch. "I'm going into the walls. If you want to survive the next 10 minutes, you need to stop being the hunter and start being the ghost." She didn't wait for his permission. She clicked the grate open. For the first time since the storm, the power imbalance shifted. Taesung was the one trapped in the light, and Aaliyah was the only one who knew how to move in the dark. The panic room was a concrete box hidden behind the master suite's wardrobe. It felt smaller than the bedroom, crowded by racks of servers and emergency oxygen tanks. Outside, the muffled sound of a heavy door being kicked and echoed through the vents, followed by the systematic shattering of glass. The registry had reached the 50th floor. Taesung sat on a steel bench, his long coat draped beside him. He wasn't looking at the monitors, which were still dead, but at Aaliyah. She sat across from him, her back against the cold wall. She had retreated from the vent at the last second when the hallway filled with the scent of ozone and floor cleaner. "The drive I took from your pocket," Taesung said, his voice low and scraping in the small space. "It doesn't just contain financial records. I had my technicians run a partial scan before the power died." Aaliyah stayed still. She noticed the way his shadow stretched across the floor, steady despite the chaos just inches away behind the reinforced steel. "There are names on that drive," he continued. "Names of children who were moved through the Sterling estate over the last 20 years. Most of them have no death certificates, no paper trails, just a final placement note." Her eyes moved across the list in silence, then they stopped. Mia. Age 9 status closed. Aaliyah didn't react, but something inside her did. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You aren't a witness to a financial scandal, Aaliyah. You're the only final placement that ever came back. That's why Gene betrayed me. He didn't do it for money. He did it because the registry threatened his own family. They don't want the money back. They want the evidence of the disappearances." Aaliyah looked down at her hands. Her skin was still pale from the storm, but her fingers weren't shaking anymore. "My foster father didn't just sign ledgers," she said. "He signed lives away. I was supposed to be the last one. I was supposed to sign the final transfer for a girl named Mia, but I took the drive instead." The air in the panic room felt thinner. Taesung watched her, his expression shifting from suspicion to a cold, hard realization. He had thought he was protecting a victim of corporate greed. Now he realized he was holding the detonator to a bomb that could level the entire city's elite. "If I open that door," Taesung said, "I am declaring war on every powerful family in this country. Not just the Sterlings. All of them." Aaliyah looked up. "You already declared war when you checked my pockets, Taesung. Now you just have to decide if you're going to fight it or hand me over." Taesung stood up and walked to the primary server. He pulled a small, silver key from his vest. "I don't like being used," he said, "but I like being told what to do even less." He turned the key, and a hidden compartment opened, revealing a secondary communication line that didn't rely on the hotel's grid. He wasn't calling for a ceasefire. He was calling for reinforcements. He had made his decision. He wasn't just her accomplice anymore. He was her shield. The hum of the emergency servers was the only sound in the small room. Taesung watched the secondary communication line as it pulsed with a steady, green light. He didn't speak, giving Aaliyah the space to look at the screen he had just unlocked. On it was a list of names, hundreds of them, stretching back decades. Aaliyah pointed to a small code next to the most recent entries. "Everyone thinks the Sterlings are just greedy," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the cramped space. "They think it's about tax evasion or offshore accounts. But the money is just a side effect. They are the intake center." She didn't look at Taesung, but she could feel the stillness in his posture. She noticed the way his grip tightened on the edge of the steel table. "The registry isn't a gang," Aaliyah continued. "It's a system. They find people who won't be missed, foster kids, runaways, people without families, and they turn them into ghosts. Some are sold into labor. Others just vanish to satisfy the debts of the powerful. The Sterlings are the ones who sign the papers to make it legal. They turn a human being into a line of code that can be deleted. They weren't numbers, she said quietly. They were waiting for someone to come back for them. She swallowed. No one ever did. Taesung leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. He saw names of high-ranking officials, judges, and even rival syndicate leaders. This wasn't a local scandal. It was the foundation of the city's entire power structure. The Sterlings weren't the bosses. They were the librarians for a national network of human trafficking. If this drive goes public, Taesung said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register, it doesn't just burn the Sterlings. It burns the people who keep the lights on in this city. It burns the people I do business with. He turned away from the screen and looked at the reinforced door. The muffled sounds of the hit squad outside had stopped. The silence was worse. It meant they were no longer searching. They were preparing. Aaliyah stood up, her shoulder brushing against a rack of cold metal. That's why they left me in the storm. I wasn't just a witness. I was the person they trusted to manage the disposable list. They thought I was one of them. They didn't realize I was keeping my own list the whole time. Taesung reached into his coat and pulled out a small, encrypted phone. He didn't call his guards. He dialed a number he had vowed never to use, the head of a rival faction that had been decimated by the registry years ago. The stakes just changed, Taesung said, looking at Aaliyah with a new kind of respect. I was going to kill Jean for betraying me. Now, I'm going to use him to broadcast the truth. We aren't leaving this hotel until every name on that drive is on the evening news. Taesung ended the call, not because he had a plan, but because he realized she already did. Aaliyah nodded. She had spent her life being a ghost. Now, for the first time, she was the one haunting the house. The sound of the hallway door breaching was distant but sharp, like the crack of dry wood. Taesung didn't reach for a rifle. He sat back at the server console, his long fingers hovering over a touch screen. On the one working monitor, thermal heat signatures appeared, 6 red glows moving in a tight formation through the foyer. They move like soldiers, not street thugs, Taesung noted. His voice was a calm murmur, the sound of a man who had already accepted the chaos. He tapped a command, and the heavy fire doors in the north corridor hissed shut, sealing the team into a narrow path. Aaliyah didn't stay to watch. She was already by the wall, pulling the brass grate from its frame. She noticed a faint layer of dust on the floor. No one had used these vents in years. She looked at Taesung. He didn't offer a goodbye. He only nodded toward the vent, his attention returning to the digital maze he was building for their visitors. Inside the vents, the air was cold and smelled of old iron. Aaliyah moved with a silence she had perfected during years of avoiding the Sterling's late-night arguments. Below her, through the slats of the ventilation grates, she saw the hit squad. They were dressed in gray tactical gear, no insignias, no names. They were as anonymous as the children they trafficked. She reached the intersection above the main elevator bank. Looking down, she saw Jean. He was holding a radio, his face illuminated by the red emergency lights. He looked tired. He wasn't barking orders, he was listening. The registry says the girl is secondary now. A voice crackled through Jin's radio. If Kim won't hand over the drive, level the floor. The clients want the data destroyed, not recovered. Aaliyah's heart didn't race, it went cold. She realized then that the Sterlings had lost control of their own cleaners. The system had decided that the risk of exposure was greater than the value of the records. This wasn't a kidnapping anymore. It was an execution of everyone on the 50th floor. She reached into her pocket and felt the encrypted drive. It was small, light, and held the weight of 1,000 ruined lives. She made a decision. She didn't head back to the panic room. Instead, she began to crawl toward the hotel's central server hub at the end of the hall. Taesung's herding was working. He was using the hotel's lights and locks to move the hit squad away from the hub. He was playing a game of chess, but Aaliyah was the only one who knew the board was about to be burned down. She needed to reach the hub before the gray-clad men realized that Taesung was just a distraction. The corridor war was silent, fought with magnetic locks and bated breath. As Aaliyah reached the final vent above the server room, she saw the silhouette of the Sterling fixer waiting by the door. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at his watch. They were out of time. The server room door didn't open with a key. It hissed open as Tae-sung overrode the lock from the panic room. Aaliyah dropped from the vent, landing lightly on the cold floor. The air here was vibrating with the roar of cooling fans. In the center of the room, her foster father, Mr. Sterling, stood waiting. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was in his silk suit, looking out of place among the blinking lights and steel racks. He looked at Aaliyah, his eyes traveling to the flash drive in her hand. "You were always the smart one, Aaliyah," he said. His voice was smooth, the same voice he used at charity galas. "That's why this is so disappointing. You know how the world works. Some people are the foundation, and others are just the bricks. You were supposed to be a foundation." Tae-sung's voice cut through the speakers in the ceiling. "The foundation is cracked, Sterling. Your cleaners are already preparing to burn this floor. They aren't here for the girl anymore. They're here to erase you." Sterling flinched. He looked at the shadows by the door, where the gray-clad hit squad was closing in. He realized then that he had been traded. To the registry, he was now just another disposable asset. Aaliyah stepped forward, her silhouette small against the massive servers. She didn't look afraid. She held up her phone, the screen showing a live connection to every major news outlet in the city. "Tae-sung has the firepower to keep them back for 5 minutes, she said quietly. "That's all I need." "You have nothing," Sterling hissed, stepping toward her. "The drive is encrypted. You can't prove a thing without my biometric key." Aaliyah didn't blink. "I don't need the key for the drive. I need you to say the words." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that the sensitive server microphones picked up perfectly. "Tell me about the Blue Room, Father. Tell me what happened to Mia on the night of the storm." Sterling's face went pale. The Blue Room was a secret within a secret, a place even the registry wasn't supposed to know about. It was his personal trophy room. For a second, the mask of the billionaire fell away, replaced by the panicked look of a man who had been caught in his own trap. "I did what I had to do to protect the legacy," he spat, his voice cracking. "The girl was a liability. I sent her to the docks myself. It was business, Aaliyah. Just business." He stopped, realizing too late that the green light on the server rack wasn't a power indicator. It was the live signal. Aaliyah looked at the screen. The view counts were climbing into the millions. The kill shot wasn't a bullet. It was his own confession, broadcast to a world that was finally watching. "Business is over," Aaliyah said. Tae-sung stepped through the server room door, his weapon lowered but ready. Tae-sung didn't step in to save her. He stepped in exactly when she needed him to. Like he had finally understood the role she had written for him. He looked at Aaliyah, then at the broken man on the floor. The power had shifted for the final time. The Sterlings weren't the librarians anymore. They were the lead story. The penthouse was silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The red emergency lights had been replaced by the soft, blue glow of dawn filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the sirens of the state police were fading as they led the Sterlings and the remaining registry agents away. Tae-sung stood by the window, his back to the room. He had a small bandage on his hand, the only sign of the night's struggle. He didn't look at the city. He looked at Aaliyah's reflection in the glass. She was sitting at the mahogany table, holding a small, leather-bound book that had been tucked inside the server rack. "The police found 3 other intake centers based on your father's confession," Tae-sung said. "The system is breaking. By noon, the Sterlings will be nothing." He turned around, his eyes dark and questioning. "There is one thing I cannot map out. The storm was a whiteout. My route was changed at the last minute because of a downed power line. No one knew I would be on that road. Not even Jean." He walked closer, stopping a few feet from the table. How did you know my SUV would be there, Aaliyah? How did you know exactly where to collapse? Aaliyah didn't answer with words. She slid the leather book across the table. Taesung opened it. It wasn't a diary of feelings. It was a log of patterns. It contained months of his travel logs, his fuel receipts, and even the maintenance schedule of his black SUV. I didn't wait for the storm, Aaliyah said. She tapped the journal with one finger. I built it. Taesung didn't move, but his grip on the book tightened. The power line, the route changed, the timing, she continued. Then she met his eyes. You weren't passing through. You were arriving. You weren't cast out, Taesung whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You baited them into locking the door. You knew they would choose that night to erase you. Aaliyah stood up. She looked smaller than him, but in the morning light, she seemed to take up more of the room. I needed a shield that the registry couldn't buy. I needed a man who hated being told what to do more than he hated the law. I studied every predator in this city, Taesung. You were the only one with the right kind of pride. Taesung looked at the book, then at the girl he thought he had saved. He had spent his life thinking he was the one holding the leash, the one watching the monitors. Now he realized he was just another part of her plan. He wasn't the hunter. He was the prize. A small, genuine smile touched Taesung's lips, the first one Aaliyah had seen. It wasn't a smile of kindness, but of recognition. The Sterlings are gone, he said, closing the journal. What is your next move, architect? Aaliyah walked toward the door. The registry still has the keys to the other cities. And now, I have the man who knows how to pick the locks. She didn't wait for him. She walked out of the suite, and for the first time, Taesung Kim followed someone else's lead. And for the first time in his life, Taesung Kim realized he hadn't found her. She had chosen him.